Inspiration can come from anywhere, even bedding. I love patterns and geometry, so I follow a number of quilting blogs on Instagram and Pinterest. And today I'll show you how I use these photos, plus my lines process, to transform them into cards. If you've been here before, you know all about LIMES. This acronym helps you analyze your inspiration and then change it up so that you can make your own. It stands for list, include, modify, exclude, and spin. I recently made a video where I went into depth about how it works, and I provided a free checklist which you can still grab. So today, I'll keep it quick since I have 4 cards to share. Let's start with this one. This quilt is made up of black, white, and gray with pops of pink, orange, yellow, and purple. It's a grid of mandala or medallion shaped patterns. I focused on the mandala and I used this 4-layer mandala quad stencil from Waffle flower. It's the perfect size to fit on my panel and become the focal image of my design. I'm using my Brutus Monroe stick and stamp mat to hold my cardstock and then taping each stencil on top since the stencil is the same size as my panel. As with any layering stencil set, you need to place each layer in the same spot, so I'm lining it up along the edges of my cardstock panel. My first color is Twilight, which is a light gray, and I used a small blending brush to blend the ink in. For my next layer, I used Blackjack, which is a darker gray ink. I had already decided that layer 3 was where I was going to add my colors, since the design elements are all around the outside edge. I used 2 colors, Tutti Frutti and Party Dress, to get a blend and more interest. For my final layer, I used Blackjack again with a heavy hand. And then to get it even darker, I let it dry and went back in with another layer. To release your panel from the sticky mat without curling the cardstock, it's best to bend the mat back. Once the 2 ends of the cardstock are free, you can carefully peel it back and it'll be perfectly flat. To finish this card, I trimmed the mandala with a circle die and I added it to a mat that I had blended with Party Dress, Flirty Fuchsia, and Limoncello, and I added some black frames. I added lots of Rose Garden sparkles from Crafty Meraki. They flash pink and orange depending on the light, and they're the perfect finishing touch. Let's compare. I included the colors and the mandala. I modified the number of mandalas, and I didn't really exclude anything, and for my spin, I made it into a square card with a round focal point. Okay, this next quilt inspiration is just screaming out for ink blending, don't you think? The colors are Pastel Rainbow, there's another mandala, quite a floral looking one, and there's lots of texture, and there's these interesting little 2-color bars along the edge. I'm an accountant, so they look like a bar graph to me, and it's an interesting choice, I think, for contrast. I started by blending my Pastel Rainbow, starting with Limoncello in the center. When you're starting ink blending in the center of your page, it's important to go in with a very light hand and be patient and build up the layers. This will help prevent any harsh lines. Next, I grabbed It's a Girl and I blended in a larger circular motion around the yellow, trying to create some peachy tones by overlapping. Then I grabbed Serenade, which is a gorgeous periwinkle, and I got my first harsh line because I was getting impatient. Now I'm not too worried about it because I know these inks will smooth out as they dry, and I also know I'm going to be putting another layer of color on through a stencil in a few minutes. Finally, I used Cummerbund, and this time I came in from the edges of the cardstock, which is a much more familiar feeling for ink blending. I went back over each color to be sure I was happy with the blends, and then I cleaned off the mat with a baby wipe. As soon as it's dry, it's sticky again. Then I brought in the BoHo Medallion stencil from a Colorful Life Designs. Because this stencil is 6x6 and it extends past my card panel, it actually sticks to the sticky mat and I don't need to tape it down. Then I just blended the same inks through the stencil, going back and forth between the colors to get a nice blend. This intensifies the colors quite a bit, but they will dry back. To add texture to the panel, I used the stencil itself like an embossing folder. I taped the panel to the stencil and ran it through my die cutting machine. Now the tricky part of doing this is finding the right sandwich for your machine. You definitely need a soft embossing mat in your sandwich, and then beyond that you need to build it up so that there's enough pressure to get the impression, but not so much that it damages your stencil. I suggest starting with a thin sandwich, and before removing the panel from the stencil, check the back to see how far the impressions are going in. If you're not happy with it, add a cardstock shim and send it through again. And if your machine has trouble accepting your sandwich or sounds like it's working too hard, it's probably too thick, and try removing a layer. To add some sparkle and shimmer, I spritzed the panel with some Avery Clear Shimmer Spray. This has the added benefit of softening the colors and the blends even more, giving the pastel look of the inspiration. To finish this card, I trimmed a circle from the center and I added a brightly colored sentiment strip with another color on the edge. I added some periwinkle gems from Crafty Meraki. I included the pastel rainbow colors, the mandala design with texture, and I even managed to work in the bar graph element. I modified the placement of the bar, and again I didn't really exclude anything, and for my spin I added that negative circular frame around the center. This quilt has a look of watercolor, intense rainbow colors, excluding green, on an angle with a geometric feeling background. I used my gel plate and some targeted ink smooshing. I started with Glam, which is a dark purple, and I put a line of it down onto the gel plate. I spritzed it with some water to get it moving, and then I spent a minute trying to figure out how to bend back my watercolor cardstock to get the ink on the angle I wanted. Then I dried it with my heat gun and my foil shoebox lid. This lid means that my fingers are far away from the heat gun, and I think the foil helps reflect back the heat and reduce warping. Ink smooshing is a very repetitive process, and I repeated the same thing with the leftover ink, and then I did a line of navy ink to try and intensify that purple a bit more. Then I moved on to the top portion and I used Flirty Fuchsia and Party Dress. There are lots of alternatives for getting a similar look. You can ink smoosh on a glass mat or on a slick surface like a silicone mat or water media mat. You could use ink refills rather than the ink pads, and you could use watercolor brushes. When I had that all done, I moved to the other side, which is a little trickier since purple and orange and yellow don't always mix that well. I started with the yellow and I got a bit of mud where it mixed with the purple, so I brought in some samba to help with the transition between the two colors, and that gave me a nice rich orange. I still wasn't happy with the intensity of that center purple, so I grabbed Queen for the Day, which is a dark blue purple, and that worked. In fact, it worked so well, I felt like I needed to break up the intensity a little bit, and I tapped some water over the top, letting it sit for a minute before I removed some of the color with a paper towel. While the panel was still a little bit damp, I used my Altenew angled Mosaic embossing folder to add that geometric feel from the photo. Thick cardstock can crack when you emboss it, so that added moisture helped here. Then I got out my Avery white ink spray and I tapped that over top, and finally added some gold splatter with my Altenew metallic watercolors. I spritzed water into the pan, loaded my brush, and then just tapped it over top. To finish this card, I used a big stacked up Celebrate die cut from Crafty Meraki, along with some shiny gold pearls. I've included the intense rainbow colors on an angle and the geometric background. I added a big white sentiment to break up that intense color as well as gold accents. My final quilt inspiration has various blues, fuchsia, and white. It's a grid of color with a snowflake cut off in the bottom right corner. It has a narrow fuchsia frame all around it. I started by putting my sticky mat in my MISTI so that I could put the card panel in the center of my background stamp. Because the background stamp is red rubber with foam, I've already removed the black foam from the MISTI. I'm going to be restamping this later, so I want to be sure I know exactly where that white panel is positioned, and the lines on the sticky mat make that really easy. I stamped this stained glass background stamp from Simon Says Stamp with Tranquil ink, which is a very pale periwinkle. I took the panel out of the MISTI and I grabbed my bold snowflake from a Jillian Vance design. I placed it over the edge and cut it from the panel, keeping all the little bits from the edges in the center. Then I started coloring, and this took a minute. I chose a number of Copic colors and I went around filling them all in. I'm not sure I got the proportion of each color exactly the same as my inspiration, but I also made sure to color the center and edge bits from the snowflake. When I had everything colored in, I grabbed a piece of scratch paper and I put lots of adhesive on it, especially down in that corner where the snowflake is going. Then I put all the pieces of the panel back together, just like a puzzle. I call this inlaid die cutting, and the result is a panel that is flat, but it still has the interest of the die cut in it. When I had all the pieces back together, I turned the panel over and gave it a good burnish to be sure that everything was really stuck on. Then I put the panel back into my MISTI, ensuring that I lined it up where it had been stamped the last time. I inked up the stamp with Wow Embossing ink, which is a clear, sticky ink, and then I poured silver embossing powder over top, put the panel into that foil-lined shoebox lid, and heated the powder until it was all melted and shiny. At this point, I knew I had made a mistake. I really did not love the look of the silver embossing on the snowflake, and I realized that white embossing powder would have saved me a step later on. But of course, I was not starting over with all that coloring, so I just kept going. For some all-over sparkle, I coated the whole panel with that Sticky Wow embossing ink. Then I poured Halo embossing powder over top. This is a clear powder with sparkle in it, and it's a great way to turn any piece of paper you have into glitter paper. I do find that when I'm heating up embossing powder that goes all over the cardstock, whether it's like this or even just a background stamp like in the last step, it's really important to ensure that you've heated and melted all the areas. I try to work in a pattern across the cardstock, but even then, before I turn off the heat gun, I tilt it in the light to be sure that everything's melted. Because I didn't love the little silver veins on the snowflake, I realized that I should have cut a clean snowflake to inlay into the panel way back, but I was able to fix it by just adding another white snowflake on top of the panel, adhering it with liquid glue. To finish the card, I trimmed the panel down to a square, and I added another panel behind it that I had pressed Flirty Fuchsia and Party Dress ink onto before heat embossing it with that same halo powder. I included all the colors on this card, the offset white snowflake, and the fuchsia frame. I modified the background from a grid of squares to this kind of pebbly looking design, and I used a different proportion of blues. I didn't exclude anything, and for my spin, I added lots of sparkle with the heat embossing. I'd love to hear about the unusual places you get your inspiration from, so please leave me a comment below. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.